So to get us started, Steve, I will kick it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Nova. Thanks, Serena. Thanks, everybody, for joining this morning. We're going to go through the main topic of today's presentation is 10 tips for 3D presentations. There's a number of things that I kind of want to touch on before we get into it. First off, we do a lot at VRIFY in 3D, but 3D is just sort of one element of our business where kind of when you look at presenting and how a VRIFY presentation is different, it's really a digital presentation. And by that, I mean, when you're presenting digitally, sometimes you're presenting a PDF or a photo or a 360 photo or other content digitally. So as I walk through it today, I'm going to start off with just the difference between presenting digitally and typically it's using iPads if you use our software, and presenting sort of the analog version of going to a meeting with paper. And then from there, we'll work into 3D presentation tips and so on. So I've plugged my iPad into my computer, and I'm going to share my screen here. Bear with me. It's the first time I've ever actually done this. So hopefully everybody can see that beautiful rock. It's the background of my iPad. And at VRIFY, we have everything we do is web-based, so it works within a browser. But we also have what's called a native iOS app, so an app that just works within an iPad. And the reason we have that specifically for iPad is because an iPad is 10 times as powerful as any other tablet out there. But what it allows for is in-person meetings. It allows you now, as of just a few weeks ago, we finally launched this feature. You can now do offline meetings, meaning you no longer need internet to connect iPads together for in-person meetings. And it's something that you obviously can't do within a web browser. So that's one of the primary reasons we also have this app. So I'll click on the VRIFY app, and you can see that I'm logged in here. So right up at the top, it says VRIFY Webinars. That's the name of my company. In mining company, exploration company, X, whatever it is, you would have all of your presentations here. Now, for an in-person meeting, I would hit present, and then there's a few different options. I'm going to click on the second one, in-person meeting. Here it says my Wi-Fi is enabled. All that means is your Wi-Fi is turned on. It does not mean that you're connected to a Wi-Fi router and have connection to the internet. And that's because we use Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and a couple other things to connect these iPads together. So I'll just click that button. And now what pops up is every other iPad nearby that I want to bring into the meeting. So this is a brand new feature for VRIFY. There's no internet being used here. You can see there's another one that says iPad. What highly recommend to all of our companies, all the companies we work with, for any iPads you use in meetings, go change the name so it doesn't say iPad. It should say kind of VRIFY iPad 1 or something like that. The reason being, we're about to go to a conference. There's the Beaver Creek and Denver Gold conferences kicking off, and there's going to be 30 to 50 companies presenting using VRIFY and iPads. So all I do is click add, join. If that iPad does not have everything downloaded, if that iPad doesn't have everything downloaded, then what'll happen is it'll just shoot it over, and it takes all of 10 seconds, and it'll be fully up to date. So here I'm going to go into the presentation. For this presentation today, and what I'm going to go through, I'm actually going to put a link within the chat. And what it'll allow for is everybody to follow along. So I'm going to continue to share my screen so you can see what I'm going through. But if you'd like to click on that link, you're going to see what's called the participant view. And that's what, when you're presenting, that's what the participant is seeing. And one of the unique elements of VRIFY's software is that what you see, this kind of control center that you have to present with, is actually quite different than what they see on the other side. I'm just going to close out of this. I'm going to start what's called a live share meeting. And just the reason I'm doing this is so I can share this over the internet. Nova, if you can see that code there, 68886, if you can throw that into the chat. Anyone's welcome to click on that or just follow along as we go through this. So getting into it, topics we're going to cover today: iPads versus paper and live presentations, presenting effectively with 3D models specifically, one-on-one investor meetings. And what I mean by that is when you walk in, usually at an investment conference, or if you're doing marketing and flying around the world and meeting with investors, that's a very different presentation than when you're standing up on stage presenting And there's a few little nuances and things that make that how you present in that scenario a little bit different. We'll go into group presentations as well. I'm going to toss it back to Serena and Nova. They're going to go through just a couple of technical tips, any actual hardware requirements and so on, and then we'll jump over to a Q&A. I have a lot to go through, so please bear with me. I'm gonna speak quite fast. So number one, iPads versus paper, and forget about 3D or anything else for a second. This is just iPads on a table in a meeting, and there's two big things that jump out when you're using iPads through the VRIFY software to present. Number one is you control the room. If you're a control freak like me, well, it's really nice to know, or it's really nice to be able to control what people are looking at in any given time. When you're in an in-person meeting, it's extremely frustrating when you look around the room and 2 or 3 different people are flipping ahead to different slides. You're trying to make a point. You sort of built up everything towards this sort of one big value proposition part of your story that you want to present, and you look over and 2 different people are kind of looking at different slides and so on. By presenting digitally, what it allows you to do is completely control what everybody's looking at any given time. And when I click, all of a sudden, say I want to click 4 slides ahead, I can jump to that, and every single iPad in the room will change to that. And what it does is it creates a very different dynamic because people don't have a choice. And we often get asked, well, what happens if somebody wants to take note? They like to scribble in the PowerPoint. What'll happen is some companies still bring a few copies of the PowerPoint. They almost never use them because what'll happen is someone will pull out a computer or a notepad and take notes alongside it. So it's one thing that's really important, and that has nothing to do with 3D technology. That's just presenting digitally. The other thing that's really crucial is this. It's the fact that as the presenter, you have a different screen than what everyone else sees. Now, if I was to, most people on this call or logged into this call have probably done a webinar or a virtual presentation. There's nothing more stressful than sharing your screen. First off, because everybody else can see everything on your computer. But the other part of it is they can see you kind of navigating through, whether it's in a PDF or PowerPoint or whatever that is. And when you have iPads connected together and you're presenting digitally, you're the only one that sees this. So as you skip through, somebody asks a question, you jump ahead 12 slides. Nobody knows you're jumping around. And what ultimately happens is the audience or the participant or the investor feels like you curated this special presentation just for them because every question they ask happens to be the next slide within your deck. It's a very different way to present. And this is really for in-person meetings and virtual meetings. This is not for standing up on stage, which is much more linear. But those are the 2 big elements of presenting digitally. The last one, and I'll use this example of looking at just a traditional mining company pitch deck. And the slide I want to point out is right here, this project economics slide. This has nothing to do with 3D. There's no topography, there's no resource blocks, drill holes, anything else. This is just numbers. And every company has numbers and charts, photos of management, things that don't belong in the 3D model. It is really, really, it's really easy to throw something us up and say, as you can see here, we're really excited about the economics of this project. And if you're sitting in a room of 2, 3, 4 people, I guarantee everybody is looking at something different. The most powerful thing you can do in an in-person presentation is annotate, because the second you draw on anything, any element, every single person in the room stares exactly at that point. And then you can also zoom in as needed if you really want to pound home whatever that is. So what this does is it's just a very different experience, because what you're doing when you go into an analog presentation with paper pitch decks is the whole time you're sort of somewhat distracted, keeping an eye on what everyone's looking at and how they're paying attention. Whereas when you walk into a room and you have everything in front of you on the table and you control what everybody looks at any given time, it's just a very, very different experience. And it's actually quite freeing as a presenter, because you know and you have confidence the entire time that you're going to be able to get to that point and make that key element, regardless if you have 10 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour for that presentation. One of the things we get asked is, well, am I supposed to, if there's 5 people in a meeting, do I have to show up with 5 different iPads? We tell all of our clients 3 iPads is enough. You'll save more than that in kind of not printing PowerPoints within a month or two. But what you do is you set them up on the table, and then 2-3 people can share as needed. But if it's more than that, you just plug in the HDMI cord the same way you would a laptop, and use the projector, or just plug in an Apple TV and connect remotely, and you don't even need a cord. So there's always a solution, but I can guarantee walking around with 3 iPads and the batteries last a lot more than a day full of meetings, no problem, is a much better, easier experience than trucking around paper and hoping that sort of there's no last minute changes to that. So that's the first part. Now I'm going to jump over to 3D tips specifically. So when you're presenting in 3D, I think in the early days of VRIFY, we often thought putting 3D models into presentations and making them accessible through web browsers was enough in itself. And the reality is it's not. When you put a bunch of 3D technical content into a presentation, there's a really high risk that you can actually make it more confusing, not less confusing. And that's why these next few tips are absolutely critical to give an effective 3D presentation. So first off, and here I'll load the Alpha Gold project. Anyone looking at the webinar and the screen that I'm showing, you might see a little bit of lag as I go through this. And that's why we've shared that link as well, because that'll actually download the 3D model and you can see it in full resolution the same way that an investor or any participant would. So just having content in 3D and being able to click through it is pretty cool in itself. But the example I want to walk through here, and I've used this specific example quite a bit, is to show how when you take technical content and put it into 3D, that how different it is. But it takes a bit of work. I'm going to jump back to that traditional pitch deck, and this time I'm going to use this one right over here, this cross section. Now, this is a cross section. It's a technical cross section. I don't have a technical background, but I'm going to do my best to try and explain it. This is actually from a company's pitch deck, and this typically would just be a slide. But here's the difference if I present this in 3D. Now, there's a few things that I'm going to do. First off, every single transition, every time I show anything on my screen, you always want to just verbalize what you're looking at. So this is the Alpha Gold project. Here we have 2 deposits right here and right here, and there's an 8-kilometer access road that sits between them. And that's it. Annotating is absolutely critical as you go through it because everyone's eyes are drawn to it. Now, what I wanted to show you, or what I want to talk about, is the exploration potential of this project. And the way I can do that is, first off, I'm just going to draw a line where that is. And one of the big things you need to do in 3D is you need to transition through every viewpoint. You can't just click to the next slide because it becomes very jarring. So by just drawing sort of where that cross section is going to be, now what I've done is I've created a viewpoint where it shows the cross section on the topography. Tip number 2 in 3D is you want to minimize this. You don't want to spin around too much. You want to, if there's a viewpoint you're trying to achieve, the best thing to do is to just use our web-based editor and just create it as a new slide. So here, all we're trying to show is where that cross section is in relation, in this case, to the old mine site. Number 3, now we're getting into the cross section. I'm a big believer that every single slide, whether it's in a PowerPoint deck or a VRIFY presentation, should have 1 or 2 key things they're trying to show. And when I look at a slide like this, there's 8, 10 different types of rocks and everything else. And you need that for the to show the technical elements of this project. But the reality is, in a quick investor pitch, nobody's digesting all of that. In this specific example, all that you need to know is that between this dotted line here and this dotted line here, there's a 200-meter wide zone where mineralization occurs. And that 200-meter wide band goes across the whole property. And because I've shown you this transition already, it's easy to visualize this 200-meter wide band across the property. And the only point that's trying to be made within this is first off, you can see kind of everything that's been found on this project so far sits within that 200-meter wide band. And at times like this is maybe you put in a really slow rotation, but the second you start spinning around and trying to zoom on things yourself, all you're going to do is lose your audience. VRIFY presentations have this full 3D layer menu. You should not be using that in presentations unless it's a very technical, specific question that you just happen to not have a slide created for. If there's something that you always end up going into your 3D layer menu in all of your presentations, you should be making a transition so it's easily accessible. And maybe it's only used in half your presentations, just skip it, skip that slide. The way that the 3D model works is at any point in time, you can skip from one slide to another, and it'll just calculate a smooth transition. And it creates a much less jarring experience. So going back to this model specifically, all this company wants you to know is that at this target sitting over here in the distance, the milestone target, all the drilling that's been done on it so far has been quite shallow. And that's what these white drill strings are. And another tip as you present in 3D is just speak the entire time of what people are seeing. What are the white things? Like, we all just make this assumption. If you see something that looks like a drill string, everybody in the room knows what that is. That's not always the case. And that drill string might be a proposed hole, a historic hole, a recent hole, an assay pending hole, can be a lot of different things. So what you always want to do is sort of break it right down. Here, you can see the drilling is very shallow. And by pulling it all together with that cross section that we already showed you, all this company wants you to know is that all the historic drilling stopped here, whereas all of the work that they've done since shows that this is the area where they should find most of the mineralization. And this is through annotating and breaking that cross section up. If we go back to that cross section, this cross section took up 6 different slides within the presentation. So it's not just what we typically do in the industry with our decks is we try to get as much as possible into individual slides. And presenting in 3D is very different. You need to look at each slide and ask yourself, what is the point I'm trying to make with this slide? And then how do I make that point using 3D content? Sometimes you actually don't even need 3D content. Just the fact that you can annotate and draw on the cross section itself might be enough. But what is that point you're trying to make with every single slide in your presentation? And then how can 3D or other elements support you in making that point? Which is very different than just saying we need a cross section in our deck that shows the geology. So continuing on through, I'll zoom back out to this. And another thing in 3D presentations is you'll end up using the same slide again and again and again. Like right now, we're looking at the Alpha Gold project. I'll come back to this same transition point 3 or 4 times in any given presentation. And what you're trying to do is ground people so they're familiar. So I don't just randomly pull up a cross section or a drill hole or a plan map and you have no idea where that is in relation to what I showed you previously. So you would never do that in PowerPoint. You never see the same slide 10 times over in PowerPoint. That's where 3D presentations are quite different. So next up, we looked at this cross section here over on the main deposit. Now we'll kind of travel down this road and check out the second deposit here. And I'll tap over, we call this one the beta. And what you're looking at here is 2 open pits sitting at the top of the mountain. Again, I might give a slow rotation manually, but nothing more than that. You don't want to start going like this and zooming around and so on, because it's really easy. It's really easy to lose the crowd. What I'm going to show you here is a lot of at VRIFY, we also do 360 photography. But if you just randomly look through a bunch of 360 photos of a site, it's really hard to understand where they are in relation to each other. Kind of, is this the access road, or is this the sort of main area they're drilling, or what is this? So what we'll often do is we'll take the 360 photography, find the viewpoint in the 3D model, and put those 2 things together. So you can, here it says beta 360 transition on the left, and I'm going to go to the next shot. And it's the exact same shot, but now it's a high resolution drone photo. And what this allows for is the drone photos and on-site photography is much higher resolution, but it's also from a fixed viewpoint, meaning that I couldn't scoot over to the other side of this mountain because the photo was taken from a specific spot. What we use drone photography for in these what we use drone photography for in these meetings is just to make very specific points. And again, your entire 3D and 360 presentation, you need to think of it like a canvas. It is there for you to tell your story, but if you just give someone a canvas and say, what do you think? They're not going to get it. It's your ability to take that 3D canvas and narrate it. And that's through transitions. And that's through the most powerful thing. And you can see I've got my Apple Pen here, is using the annotations. So in this case specifically, you can see this company drill, or there's two small open pits at surface. But the point they really like to make is that the old timers 100 years ago had all these adits, and these are the dumps, the waste rock piles from these little tunnels in the side of the mountain where they would chase these really high grade gold and silver veins. And the reason that you can't do this in 3D, and I'll go back to the 3D model, is you can kind of see them there, but you don't have the resolution. And this is actually a really high resolution photo. We're often tied to satellite imagery that isn't quite as high quality as this. I'll put a plug in there. We now have a contract with a satellite provider though. So if whenever wants to update their photos with their satellite imagery, with high resolution imagery, just let us know. But going back to it all, that is the most important thing with all of this, is that the 3D model and the VRIFY presentation you create in itself is not going to kind of change the world. It's your ability to tell a story to it. And it's why right now a VRIFY presentation that sits on your website that somebody can click through, it'll have subtitles, but it's still not nearly as effective as you going through it and annotating it and adding your own conviction in it as an executive and a believer of that company and that story, so the investor can hear that and hear that story. And it's why we've added the ability to record yourself going through your own VRIFY presentations. And I do believe you're going to start to see a lot more websites with those video recorded walkthroughs, and then maybe a link to the interactive stuff versus just the interactive content by itself. I'm just going to check my notes to make sure I didn't miss anything before I jump into the next one. One of the last things I'll say is when you're presenting in 3D, what's also really helpful is a big appendix. So what often happens is you try and get everything into your 12 or 14 PowerPoint slides. Presenting digitally is quite different. You can have a massive appendix with a whole bunch of technical content and have it accessible where you can click to. So if you only use it 1 in every 10 companies or 1 in every 10 investor meetings, that's okay, because it doesn't bog down your main narrative. So a lot of companies and a lot of people on this call actually are going to be jumping into Beaver Creek and Denver Gold conferences. And those meetings that you're going to be taking are going to be both with investors, generalists, sophisticated resource investors, but also corporates. And that's a bit of a different audience every time. And what having a big appendix does is means you can still use the same presentation, but when you jump into a meeting with a few corporate development people from a big company, you're probably not going to spend as much time talking about your share price as you are going to be talking about recent results and maybe the geology and some more technical elements. So by having that big appendix with multiple sections to it, some might be financial, geological, technical, engineering, whatever it is, everything is there at your fingertips. There's nothing wrong with having 100 slides in your appendix. And I don't mean 3D slides. Some might be 3D, but some might just be your financial statements and other elements. Having all that accessible really empowers you as a presenter, because you know that it can ask any single question and you'll be there to answer it. Or so you'll have the tools you need to answer it. Okay, next up, I'm going to keep flying through this. I think I'm doing okay for time. Investor meetings. Now, what I mean by this is in-person investor meetings, and this is slightly different. So you're likely going to use the same presentation, but how you present them is different. The number one thing is you need to ask a lot of questions, because again, using that example of retail versus institutional versus sophisticated versus corporate, everybody is looking for something different when they go and meet with you as an executive of this company. And when you have all of your content sitting at your fingertips, it frees you up, because you're not tied to, here's my 15 slides that I need to pound through. And it's really awkward if I skip 12 ahead, because then I have to ask everybody in the room to flip to that page as well. What that changes in the presentation is it's really beneficial to start that conversation with Are you familiar with our story, and what would you like to focus on today? Because I have my key elements that I want to make sure you leave here understanding, but I'd also like to understand what you as a potential investor in my company would like to learn about as well. And it creates a very, instead of this one-way puke of information, it creates a much more meaningful conversation. And because again, everything is at your fingertips, as you're answering these questions, you're jumping around, and ultimately the person you're presenting to, because the slides that they see are the slides that they see don't have your navigation bar and everything else. They walk away feeling like you curated this presentation that answered everything that they wanted to see. It's a different style of presenting, and you have to get used to it. But what you'll find is once you start doing it, it takes the handcuffs off and allows you to be to have a much more dynamic presentation. An example of that is, and as you go through a 3D presentation specifically, and I'll jump back to here where I flashed through, and most people on this call I can see have a background in the mining sector. But so by looking at this, you can see, well, that looks like a block model. But what I didn't do is I didn't stop and check. And again, this isn't a one-on-one meeting I'm in, but I didn't stop and check to ask, like, do you know what blue and green and red even mean? And if I stop and ask that question, and if maybe they do, maybe they don't, I can jump down to my appendix and show and just derail for a second and say, well, here's what the blue, the green, and the red mean. This is why we're really excited about the red, because you can see kind of it's fully oxidized, easier to get the gold out. It's going to take a lot less energy to crush it up versus, say, the unoxidized material, which is very different, much more competent. Now that I've kind of stepped off for a second, educated you on that, we can go back to that same flow, and I can talk about my milestone target, and maybe I'm talking a little bit more about how we think the oxidation zone goes below. But in a one-on-one meeting, you need to continually be asking questions like that. Another example is you might go into a meeting, and this company, and some of you might recognize the company contents I'm using. This is a pre-feasibility stage company, but it still has expiration potential. Some investors or participants in your meetings might want to focus entirely on the engineering elements of it, and that's okay. You can have a bunch of slides and transitions within your presentation that really get into the detail and show maybe the haulage routes and other elements like that. But at the same time, others might just want to focus on the exploration potential, and you want to bring in kind of your geochemistry and talk about sort of exploration targets that are sitting outside of your main sort of deposit area. And maybe we're showing things like photos of outcrop and other elements like that. Again, in a one-on-one meeting, it's absolutely critical that you have a clear idea of what you want that person to walk away with, but you also stop and check with them on what they want to focus on the most, especially at these conferences where these meetings are 20 or 30 minutes, because you don't have time to get to 28 minutes into a 38 meeting and then find out all they wanted to really discuss was the financials, because they're very familiar with everything else. One of the other things that's really important, and with in a one-on-one meeting, and I don't think anyone really does a good job with this, I never have in any of the investor pitches I've given, is to actually just leave a hook. So when you're done your meeting, you shake hands, and it's different than a sales pitch. Like if I give a sales pitch at VRIFY, we have sort of something to work for, and we know at the end of it if it was successful or not. In an investor meeting, you often don't know. Maybe if there's a financing coming up, but you often don't know if that investor went and bought shares. So we need to do everything we can to try and get insight into whether or not they actually, what you said resonated with them or not. And one of the things that you can do, it's really simple, is just add a CTA. CTA is a tech term for the miners out there. It's a call to action. So often, like if you go to our website, the primary CTA we try to drive is for people who are interested in working with VRIFY to book a demo. So our call, you see that all over our website. That is our objective of somebody visiting our marketing website. There's nothing stopping you from putting a QR code or something within your meeting. So when you're going through your presentation, you've got your iPads on the table. there might be two QR codes that come up. One is to book a follow-up meeting, and one is to get a link to the interactive content you just sent. And whether or not they book it in front of you, just the fact that someone pulls out their phone and does something gives you an indication of whether or not they're actually interested or not as well. And because a QR code can essentially link to anything, it might just be to sign up for your email list or just to your website. I don't recommend just putting it to your generic website. It should be something more specific than that. But it's a great opportunity to find out, to get some sort of subtle feedback on how your presentation went. So we're continuing to work out different ideas at VRIFY. We have interactive slides now where the iPads that are sitting in front of people, or if they're logged in to the presentation, they'll actually be able to just click on it. So they don't even have to pull out their phone and do a QR code. We have some of this working now, but we're going to continue to push this so you're not left in the sort of this void of information on the back of a meeting. Anyone going to these conferences or having done any investor conferences knows how tough it actually is at the end of the day of 20 meetings to wrap your head around kind of where everybody is at. So it's really nice if you're in a meeting, if you can sort of finalize the next step in that investor company relationship on the spot. Now, the last one here is, oh, sorry, one other thing I'll touch on too is in one-on-one meetings, one other element is the ability to pass control. So what you'll often have is, again, I'll use that screenshot of the iPads on the table. If you have a CEO and VP expiration, again, depending on who you're meeting with, we'll sort of juggle who does the most talking, what you're focused on. But the other thing you can do is you can pass control around, and whether it's an in-person meeting with iPads or whether it's remote, and you're passing control back and forth across the country in a virtual call, what it does is it sort of takes off the pressure of the main speaker to say absolutely everything. And for some, if it's a more technically inclined person you're meeting with, they often just want to hear from the actual geologist and so on. The best in the world that I've seen at this with VRIFY so far is Nucor, and Luke Alexander and their VPX Greg Smith just pass it back seamlessly. And as the host, you can always control who to give control to and so on. So it's just one more element. It takes a little bit of, it's a bit of a dance. So it's a bit of an art to master, but it's something that if you do effectively and work on, creates a very dynamic presentation that, again, is very different than saying, hey, it's your turn to talk. Can everyone pull their or turn their paper decks to slide 12 and follow along? The last one I'll touch on here is group presentations. Here you can see a photo of Darren Strallo, the CEO of Bellevue, absolute rock star with VRIFY. And what you see with this screenshot, or this one here as well, is it's a very different experience when someone's up on stage. And the reason for that is because they're not asking questions. It has to be a very linear presentation. It has to be very directed. When you're giving that group presentation, again, you can use the same VRIFY deck, but you're probably not dipping into the appendix. You're probably not jumping around. You want to do everything you can to keep it as clean and focused. Now, the two big things that change is when you get to the Q&A, and any good presentation, you'll get a lot of questions. When you get to the Q&A, every question you get asked, you should be flipping around and answering with visual cues. And what that does, it brings everybody else into that question. So if you're in an audience of 100 people and one person asks a question, if you start using 3D scenes and slides and annotating on it, what it does is everyone else in the audience is kind of drawn into that as well. It's quite different, and some companies like to have a different presentation than they use in one-on-one investor meetings, which is really easy to do with the VRIFY platform. But the whole point of it really is to ensure you're completely clear on what elements you want to walk through, and that you're not jumping around, which is a completely different experience than when you're in that one-on-one investor meeting, whether that's in person or virtual. The other thing that we really like as well is, again, using that CTA. At the end of that presentation, that group presentation, it's really nice to be able to put something up that says, hey, if you want to hear more about my company, typically what we do is in the industry is we just end with a slide that has an email address and maybe the company address and a website. And it doesn't give you as a company any information to sort of advance discussions with these investors. Whereas if you put a call to action, and again, this QR code that you can put in can link to just about anything, whether it's, again, I don't recommend putting it to your website. It should be to like your IR person's calendar, or to maybe a link to the presentation, or something that allows you, maybe it's your email subscriber list, something that allows you to go and look at that audience and start that next step in that investor journey with them. And what's really crucial about that in some of these upcoming conferences, it's not just the people in the room. This QR code will work for anybody, anybody that's watching online as well. So if your presentation is viewed a month later by an investor, at the end of that presentation, they still have that ability to book a meeting with you or take it wherever they need to. Next up, technical tips. I'm going to invite Nova and Serena back on. Serena will be at all of the conferences. Many of you have probably seen her before. So Nova and Serena are going to go through a few technical tips on what you need to be set up to show up like a rock star at these conferences. And at the end of that, if you have any questions at all, keep feeding them into the chat, and we'll do a quick Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Steve. I think it was great, seeing your end user side of the VRIFY meeting, and then also seeing your presenter view. It's really great. And just the quality difference, I feel like, really makes an impact of when you share that VRIFY meeting link and you don't get that quality lag. So it was great to see kind of the difference there. So like Steve said, before we wrap things up and kind of get to our final Q&A, we have our events and marketing operations manager, Serena, here to answer some commonly asked technical questions. So we did a little investigating for you and went through and pulled some questions that commonly get asked to Serena at events. So as Steve said, a lot of you might be familiar with her. She provides on-ground support for our clients at conferences all around the world. She liaisons with conferences AV teams to ensure verified presenters have everything they need from a technical perspective to deliver such great presentations. So coming up in the next few weeks, if you're at Precious Metals or the Gold Forum Americas this month, look out for Serena. She will be on the ground there along with our customer success manager, Teresa. So make sure you keep an eye out for her. So Serena, thanks for joining us. So my first commonly asked question is, I have a conference or presentation coming up, but I'm not sure if the AV team supports a VRIFY presentation. What do I do?
So VRIFY is partnering with more conferences around the world than ever before. So if you're planning to attend an investor conference, chances are we might already be discussing VRIFY requirements with their AV team. This is why we recommend keeping your customer success manager in the loop regarding your upcoming conference plans, as they'll be in the know about which conferences we're partnering with and will have on-the-ground support at. Regardless of whether or not we're sponsoring, we can reach out to the conference directly to confirm the technical details. So all you have to worry about is nailing your actual presentation.
That's great. And so what are exactly the technical requirements? I know we get this question a lot. Is it complicated? So what are the tech requirements?
So absolutely nothing fancy is required to support VRIFY presentations at the podium. And it's in fact super simple for AV teams to facilitate this. All we need from the AV team is an HDMI cord run from the AV desk to the podium. This does need to be confirmed in advance, and this is something your CSM can communicate to the conference team on your behalf. You also need an HDMI to iPad compatible adapter, just one of these guys. Newer model iPads will use an HDMI to USB-C adapter, which is what I'm holding in my hands here. But some older iPads will require an HDMI to Lightning adapter. If you're not sure which one you need, you can check it out by looking at the charging port on your iPad, or your CSM can help you with that as well. We always recommend bringing your own adapter with you to conferences. It's just good practice to have one with you. Or if we have VRIFY staff on the ground, you can definitely borrow one of ours. We're going to have lots available at Precious Metals and Gold Forum for you. And then when you're ready to present your deck, you're going to walk on stage, plug your iPad into the adapter, and then plug plug the HDMI cord in there. Your deck will appear behind you on the screen and you're good to start presenting.
Perfect. And I just threw some links in the chat with links to those adapters that Serena talked about and ways to identify what iPad you have, how to update it, and how to make sure the VRIFY app is updated before you present. So we talk a lot about iPads, Serena. Can you explain to me why an iPad's better? Can I use my laptop to present? What is the reason for the iPads?
Sure. So the VRIFY app comes equipped with several features to optimize the presentation experience for both the presenter and the audience. Probably most crucially, the iPad app allows you to download the deck. So as long as your deck is downloaded, which we recommend doing the night before with a stable Wi-Fi connection in your hotel room, you do not need an internet connection to show your deck at the podium. You just don't want to be at the behest of the conference Wi-Fi network, which is not always reliable. Once plugged in, the VRIFY app detects the presence of an HDMI cord and enters what we call presenter mode. Presenter mode removes the menu and host controls from the audience view, leaving them with only the full screen, high resolution view of your content. But the controls remain on your iPad so you can quickly navigate through your slides and annotate as needed, as Steve has just demonstrated. So yeah, important. iPad is best in our opinion.
Perfect. So pretty much if you were to sum it up, you would be able to download your deck ahead of time using an iPad, which means you wouldn't be concerned about Wi-Fi while you're presenting or any sort of lag. And then also when you plug in that iPad, it's also going to detect presenter mode and set everything up for you.
Yep. It's just
Perfect.
plug in and go.
That's great. Are there any other tips or tricks for us that you have? Because I know you've been on the ground at so many of these conferences, so I'm sure you have some.
Yes, so make sure your iPad operating system and VRIFY app are updated to the latest versions. You can find out if your iPad app is up to date by opening the App Store and searching for the VRIFY app. If there is an option to update, definitely do that. Again, do it the night before so you're not thinking about it on your presentation day. Make sure that the VRIFY app has all the latest performance enhancements available to you. To find out if your iPad operating system is up to date, you're going to open your iPad settings, then general, then do a software update. And that can take some time. So again, do that the night before, update as needed. It's just good best practice, again, to make sure that you're in the habit of making sure that everything's updated before your presentations. Yeah, I think that's it.
Perfect. That's great. That's super helpful. I'd like to invite Steve back up to the stage and we'll just wrap up this webinar with a quick Q&A. I know we're at time right now, but we just have a few questions that have been asked in the chat. So the very first one is, yes, this will be recorded. We'll have it on our resource center as well on our new VRIFY.com website. So make sure you check out the webinar there. So one of the questions, Steve, that we've got, and Serena, is my deck is really long. I only have 10 minutes to present a time slot. Do I have time to show my verified deck or should I just stick to my PDF slides?
Yeah, so it all depends. Like what happens for a lot of companies, and especially if you have multiple assets, is they just stick to the PDF slides up front and you have a bunch of 3D content. And depending on who you're meeting with, they might want to talk about a specific asset or even a specific element of that specific asset. So if you find that your content is too long, first thing I would do is go through and ask yourself, like, is everything that I'm trying to show within this deck absolutely critical in a 20-25 minute meeting? If it's not, don't get rid of it, just move it to the appendix and then see where you end up. You may or may not end up with 3D content in that first part. So it really comes down to just having a really clear idea of what are the most compelling parts of your presentation, not just to you, but to what you think that an investor is really going to care about. We're doing a lot of work right now, and we're in the process of actually hiring strategic advisors with extensive capital markets and mining experience to help guide our clients through this process, so we can actually help figure out what those elements are. So it's not just putting it entirely on you. We work with 150 companies and we're learning more every day about what resonates with investors and what they just don't care about, because you can see analytics on kind of where they're spending their time. So as VRIFY continues to evolve and our offering continues to evolve, expect us to start to show up and help you through that process of really understanding what is most important and what is a complete waste of time. Because like I often think about, I started my career in the sector in investor relations, working for a group of companies, and I used to write 10 press releases. There's 10 companies, so I'd write sort of 8 to 10 press releases every week or two. And we'd put little tracking links within these press releases. And what we found was every single paragraph you move down in that press release, you're losing people. And as you advance through your presentation, especially if somebody is viewing it on your website or somewhere else, regardless of how good it is, you're going to lose people as you go. So what is the most compelling elements of your presentation? What are you doing at the start of your presentation to make sure you kind of make those points? And then how do you kind of feed into that narrative as you advance? One of the things that we're gonna look at is, instead of like starting topography, region, and then moving in, we're starting to test with certain clients. Start with your most exciting drill hole, so people wake up and start paying attention, and then you've earned the right to tell them where your project sits and all of those other elements. So sorry, it's a long-winded answer to your question. Hopefully it's somewhat helpful, but it really depends on what you're trying to tell as a company. And then we can help you kind of craft that presentation strategically in a way that you can use effectively in a meeting.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thanks, Steve. So for earlier stage projects without much 3D data, how much value does digital geospatial presenting like this provide to investors?
Yeah, that's a question that actually comes up a lot. I personally think it actually creates a lot more. Mm-hmm. And the reason being is, and I use that example in the presentation, you take a topography geochem, show an anomaly with a photo of some outcrop and maybe sort of something that shows there's no historic drilling in that area. That is actually really, really compelling. The thing you have to realize is, a much smaller, earlier stage company, you don't have as much of you haven't earned as much of everyone's attention span just yet. Everyone likes, like, the bigger companies have more investors and so on. So you need to find a way to tell your whole story, ideally in sort of 60 to 90 seconds. If you can do that effectively, and I'm a big believer, the only way to really do that is to use geospatial kind of visuals and other things like that. You've then earned the right for more of their time to kind of tell the rest of your story, hopefully get to a point to where you're going to drill that target or raise money to drill that target and so on. So in a lot of ways, when we initially started, we'd do these big, heavy, kind of throw in the kitchen sink models, and we realized quite quickly that we're not here to just take technical models and put them in a presentation. We're here to extract the most critical elements and create an effective investor presentation. Those are two very different things. So again, for earlier stage companies, I actually think it's more important, because you need especially in a market like we're in right now, you need every little bit of help that you can get to sort of get onto that attention, or hook into that potential investor. When you look at the makeup of the market, there's 3,000 mining companies out there, and 2,500 of them are early stage. So it's a much more competitive field for you to go find and get that investor attention. So you need kind of all the help you can get. And we actually, and sorry, one point on that, we actually have a number of examples. So feel free to reach out. We have a lot of earlier stage companies that have had a ton of success, and we're actually launching a few more in the next couple of weeks that I think do a really good job of showing kind of pre-resource stage, early stage companies how you visualize content.
Great. I'm just going to put a link to our new website where you can check out the grassroots exploration stage and just kind of how we support it, and see a little bit of examples there as well, just kind of for those earlier companies. So one question that an Eagle Eye attendee spotted was they saw you using an Apple Pencil, Steve. And is that something that you kind of recommend people to have? Can you just talk about a little bit about your tech?
I have really fat fingers, so if I attempt to use my fingers in the meeting, again, I spent, before VRIFY, I spent a lot of my career in giving investor pitches, and an investor pitch is sort of 30% the content and 70% sort of how you show up, and sort of what, like, you're pitching yourself as much as you're pitching your company. I find things like an Apple Pen and other things that allow me to feel like a more sort of elegant presenter, because my annotations are that much clearer, and because I can be very specific, and you can easily zoom in. It's why you can use laptops to present, but I don't like annotating with a mouse. It's a very different experience. Personally, I think, like, if you're going to spend the money to get iPads to use VRIFY and so on, the $200 or $150, $200 for an Apple Pen is really, really worth it. But again, everybody has their own presentation style, and what you need to do is kind of start using VRIFY in-person meetings and see what really works for you. Yeah, for me, I honestly, I can't live without it if I start trying to draw things with my finger and so on. So it's to each their own, but I would highly, highly recommend it.
Okay, perfect. And since we're coming up on time, I'll just open it up for one last question, which I thought was really great that just came in. So with more and more companies using, coming into the modern age and using products like VRIFY to kind of be more transparent and more digital, and have these great looking presentations, how do they continue to stand out and wow their audience when so many people are kind of jumping on this bandwagon as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's if we can sort of be the catalyst to cause that problem, that's a really good problem to have. I think that when we look back at how VRIFY started, it was interactive 3D presentations. And what we realized I would say in the last year and a half or so, is that an interactive presentation by itself, if I just send you a link to it and you click through it, is very different than me recording myself, annotating and going through it and sending you a link to the video of that. And it's because of the annotation, it's because of the conviction and sort of my story alongside that 3D. I think what you're going to continue to see is this evolution of different ways that and this is really on VRIFY, we'll always be open to ideas, to find ways to evolve our offering in a way that addresses that problem. So the companies that do work with VRIFY really stand out. I think one of the things that we have is we do not believe at VRIFY that there's this set number of mining investors and we need to all compete for them. I think as an industry, if our tool can help better position companies to communicate to the average person, we're going to go from sort of 1% of people know how to invest in mining to 3%. And overnight, there's 3 times as much capital for all of us. So it's a really good question, but I think I wouldn't worry too much about if everyone's using VRIFY, then how do I stand out? I think if everybody's using VRIFY, it's a big step in the right direction of solving an industry-wide problem, which is communicating sort of the value of our sector as a whole to outside investors. And if we can start to solve that problem and open the floodgates of kind of new capital coming into our sector, then yeah, maybe we have trouble standing out, but everyone's share prices are 10 times as high as they are today, so nobody actually cares. I'm happy to be sort of a sheep within that field.
Oh, that's great. That's perfect. Well, that is great. And those are kind of all the questions we have today. So I'd like to open it up for the audience and just ask you a question. If there's any webinars or any information that you're looking for specifically, as Steve said, we're always open to ideas and new webinars and new education that we can put out. So feel free to throw it in the chat or contact your customer success manager and say, hey, it'd be really great if we could learn about X, and we'd love to make these webinars a more regular thing. So thank you, Steve. Thank you, Serena, for all your insight and information. And thank you to everybody for attending. This will live on our resource center on verify.com in the next couple of days, so you can check out the recording there. But in the meantime, thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you at our next one. And
Nova, the last thing I'll add to that, and thanks to you both as well. If anybody wants to go through go through their own investor presentation with someone from our team and kind of walk through not just a bit of training, but just get feedback on how you're using it, what you're using it, and so on, feel free, just reach out to your CSM, your client success manager, whoever that is. What's really helpful for us, if you want, there's a record button. If you're a VRIFY client and have admin access, there's a record button on your presentation. Record yourself going through it and send us that as well. If you record it, send us the link to that. And then what that'll do is we'll review that, and then we can go into a meeting and talk about our ideas and what we're seeing. I just realized one of the most important tips that I completely forgot about through this whole presentation I give every time is annotation color. Whatever you're drawing on, if it's a dark background, use white. If it's a white slide, use black. That is the #1 tip I give to everybody. So ensure that if you send us any of those videos that you check your annotation color as well. Thanks, everyone.
I love it. We'll save that tip for only the people who stay to the end. So it's great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks
Okay.
so much, Steve. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next time.
Everyone.
Bye.